The laughter started the morning the cart arrived, creaking over the rutted road that cut through Millbrook like a scar. It was a Tuesday in late March, the kind of morning when the sky hangs low and gray and the wind carries the smell of thawing earth and old secrets. The cart was loaded with terracotta pipes, hundreds of them, stacked like the bones of some ancient creature, their orange-brown surfaces dulled by road dust and the fingerprints of the potter who had shaped them 3 counties over. They were not new pipes, not the smooth, machine-pressed kind that carried water to the new houses going up near the highway. These were hand-thrown, irregular, their walls thick and porous, their openings slightly oval rather than perfect circles. Some had hairline cracks. Some bore the ghost impressions of the potter's thumbs. They looked like artifacts from another century, which, in a way, they were. Eleanor Vance stood beside the cart in her late husband's canvas coat, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands already marked with the red clay dust that would never fully wash out in the months to come. She was 53 years old, though the lines around her eyes and the gray threading through her dark hair made her look older in the hard morning light. She had been farming this land alone for 11 years. Since Thomas died of the pneumonia that took him in 2 weeks during the winter of 1987. Their only child, a daughter named Margaret, had married a man in the city and visited twice a year with grandchildren who stared at the barn like it was a museum exhibit. Eleanor had not remarried. She had not hired help beyond the seasonal hands who came and went like weather. She had simply worked the land, 200 acres of wheat and corn, and the vegetable plot that kept her fed through the winters, and she had watched the water table drop year after year like a clock running down. The pipes had cost her nearly everything. She had sold the truck, the one Thomas had bought new in 1983, and kept running through sheer mechanical stubbornness. She had sold the antique dresser that had been her grandmother's, the one with the mirror that showed generations of Vance women getting ready for church. She had sold the silver, not that there was much, and the spare tractor parts, and the calf she had been raising for market. The money had gone to a potter named Isaiah Whitfield, who worked in a converted barn outside of Marston, and looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language when she described what she wanted. Not drainage pipes, not sewer pipes, pipes with walls thick enough to hold water, porous enough to weep it slowly into surrounding soil, pipes with one end sealed, one end open, buried at an angle so the open end sat just below the surface, accessible for refilling, while the sealed body descended deep into the root zone. Like an olla, she had said, and Isaiah had nodded slowly, understanding finally because his own grandmother had gardened with ollas in New Mexico before the family moved east. Like an olla, he agreed. But bigger, much bigger. He had charged her more than the pipes were worth in any conventional accounting. She had paid without bargaining, which made him uncomfortable, and he had thrown in the smaller ones for the vegetable garden at no cost, which made her cry in his barn where no one could see. Now the pipes sat on her cart, and the laughter began. It was the Henderson boys who started it, though they were men in their 30s now, not boys, and should have known better. They were passing on the road in their father's old Ford, the one with the muffler that needed replacing, and they slowed to a crawl when they saw the cart and the woman standing beside it in a coat that had belonged to a dead man. The elder Henderson, Caleb, leaned out the window, his face red from early morning drinking or the wind or both. "Eleanor Vance, you opening a plumbing supply?" His brother, Jude, laughed from the passenger seat, the sound carrying across the bare field like something physical, something that could leave marks. "She's burying 'em," Caleb called, reading the situation faster than his brother, or perhaps simply more cruelly. "Look at that. She's gonna bury pipes in the dirt." They drove on, the bad muffler popping like gunfire, the laughter trailing behind them like exhaust. Eleanor did not look up. She had learned, in 11 years of farming alone, that acknowledgement was fuel. She counted the pipes instead, running her hand along their cool surfaces, feeling the slight irregularities that meant they were shaped by human hands and not machines. There were 312. She had ordered 300. Isaiah had made extra, just in case, and refused payment for the overage. By noon, half the county knew Harold Crenshaw came by in his deputy's cruiser, and not because there was any law against burying pipes in your own field, but because Harold had nothing better to do, and because the Henderson boys had stopped at the diner and told everyone. And the diner was where information moved faster than the telephone. He sat in his car with the window down, his forearms resting on the door, watching Eleanor unload the first pipe and carry it to the spot she had marked with a stake and a length of baling twine. "Eleanor," he said, not unkindly. Harold had gone to school with Thomas, had been at the funeral, had helped her change a tire in the rain one night when he was still a young deputy and she was still a young widow. "You okay?" "Fine, Harold. Those pipes. You know you can't just— there's no law, but the Water Commission might have questions if you're doing some kind of irrigation without permits." "I'm not taking water from the creek, Harold. I'm putting water in." He looked at the pipe in her hands, thick as her thigh, long as her arm. He looked at the field, still brown and dormant, the winter wheat just beginning to show green at the tips. He looked at the sky, which promised nothing. "Eleanor," he said again, and stopped. There was nothing in the law books about a widow burying pottery in her own field. There was nothing in the deputy's manual about how to tell a woman she was wasting her life on something that looked, to every rational assessment, like madness. "Take care, Eleanor," he said finally, and drove away. And she heard him telling the story at the gas station that evening, heard about it secondhand from the girl who pumped her diesel, who looked at her with the wide eyes of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. The real mockery came the next day, when the field was ready and the planting began. Eleanor had not simply dug holes and dropped in pipes. She had planned. For 6 months, through the fall and winter, she had studied. Not in libraries. Millbrook had no library, and the county branch was 20 miles away, and staffed by a woman who disapproved of farmers who thought they could read their way out of problems. Eleanor had studied in her kitchen, by lamplight, with books ordered from used bookstores in cities she had never visited, books on ancient irrigation, on the qanats of Persia, underground channels that carried water for thousands of years, on the clay pot irrigation of sub-Saharan Africa, where women buried unglazed pots between crops and filled them weekly, and the pots wept moisture into the root zone like slow tears. On the buried clay pipe systems of the American Southwest, abandoned when the wells came in and the aquifers seemed bottomless. Forgotten now except in the memories of old people and the pages of books no one checked out anymore, she had adapted. The qanats were too large, too dependent on gravity and elevation. The ollas were too small, designed for kitchen gardens, not fields. But the principle was the same: clay weeps. Unglazed terracotta, fired at the right temperature, is not a barrier to water but a membrane. Water moves through it by capillary action, drawn by the drier soil outside, moving from wet to dry, from pipe to root, slowly, constantly, without the waste of surface evaporation or the violence of sprinkler spray. A buried clay pipe, sealed at the bottom, filled from the top, becomes a reservoir that speaks the language of roots. It does not flood. It does not drought. It simply gives, at the rate the soil can receive, at the depth where roots are hungry, she had calculated. 200 acres was too much for full coverage, so she had selected the 60 acres of the south field. the one with the best soil and the worst water access, the one that had produced 30 bushels to the acre last year when it should have produced 60. She had laid out a grid, each pipe centered in a zone that radiated roughly 15 feet in all directions, the distance the moisture would travel through this soil type at this density. The pipes would sit at a 45-degree angle, open end northeast, away from the prevailing wind, accessible for filling but not so exposed that evaporation would steal from the opening. They would descend 3 feet to the sealed base, deep enough to reach the corn's deepest roots, shallow enough to be filled without equipment she didn't have. She had marked each spot with a stake. 312 stakes, each with a number scratched into the wood with her pocket knife, corresponding to a map she had drawn on graph paper and taped to her kitchen wall. The map showed the field as a constellation of circles, each one a pipe, each one a promise. The digging took 3 weeks. She dug with a post-hole digger, the kind with wooden handles and steel blades that bite into earth and require you to lift the weight of the world with each thrust. She had considered renting an auger, but the auger would make holes too wide, too smooth, too likely to let the pipes shift and tilt. She needed the holes tight, the pipes snug, the clay in direct contact with the soil on all sides so the capillary bridge could form. So she dug by hand, 12 holes a day, her shoulders burning, her hands blistering and callousing and blistering again until the skin hardened into something like leather, something that no longer felt pain in the way it once had. The Henderson boys drove by every morning. They did not stop after the first day, but they slowed always, and Caleb hung out the window with a camera now, a disposable thing from the drugstore, taking pictures that would appear in the diner, and later, when the story got bigger, in the county newspaper with a caption about local eccentricity. "There's the pipe lady," they called, and variations on the theme. "Burying her treasure. Looking for oil, Eleanor? Looking for gold? Hey, Eleanor, my toilet's backed up. You got any spare pipes?" She did not look up. She dug. She set each pipe in its hole, back-filled with the native soil, mixed with a handful of compost to improve the capillary connection, tamped the earth firm with the heel of her boot, and moved to the next stake. By the time she reached the end of each row, the beginning was invisible, the pipes hidden, the field looking unchanged except for the stakes that marked their locations like the graves of something buried alive. Mrs. Patterson from the church came on the second Tuesday. She was 70, widowed longer than Eleanor, a woman whose kindness was genuine but whose need to be helpful was relentless. She brought a casserole, tuna and noodles with potato chips crushed on top, the kind of dish that appeared at funerals and illnesses, and, apparently, at the homes of women who had lost their minds. "Eleanor, dear," she said, standing at the edge of the field in shoes that were not meant for dirt, holding the casserole dish in both hands like an offering. "The girls at the church are worried." "I'm fine, Mrs. Patterson. They say you're burying pipes, hundreds of pipes, in the ground." "Yes, for what purpose, dear?" Eleanor straightened from the hole she was digging, number 147, and wiped her forehead with her sleeve. The March sun was weak but persistent, and she had worked up a sweat that steamed slightly in the cool air. "For water, Mrs. Patterson. For when there isn't any. But the well, dear, your well, and the creek. And surely if there's a drought, the county will, there are programs, assistance. You don't need to bury pottery like some kind of, she trailed off, unable to find a word that was both accurate and kind. "Like some kind of crazy person," Eleanor finished for her. "I know what it looks like. It looks like you're throwing away your savings on something that can't possibly work. Harold Crenshaw says you sold your truck, your grandmother's dresser." "Eleanor, those pipes cost more than this field is worth." "Yes," Eleanor said, "they do, Then why? Eleanor looked at the hole, at the pipe waiting beside it, at the field stretching away in rows of stakes that would soon be invisible. She thought of Thomas, who had trusted the well, trusted the creek, trusted the rain to come when it always had, until the year it didn't, and the wheat died standing, and they had to buy feed on credit. They were still paying off when the pneumonia took him. She thought of the books on her kitchen table, the maps on her wall, the nights she had spent calculating evaporation rates and soil percolation, and the thermal mass of fired clay. She thought of Isaiah Whitfield's grandmother, who had grown tomatoes in the desert with nothing but ollas and captured rainwater, and who had died at 92 with hands that looked like Eleanor's were starting to look. Because the water table drops 2 feet every year, Mrs. Patterson. Because the creek was dry by August last year and the year before and the year before that. Because the well will go dry in my lifetime, maybe in the next 5 years, and when it does, everyone who laughed at me will be trying to remember what I did and how I did it. Mrs. Patterson set the casserole on the tailgate of Eleanor's remaining vehicle, the old Jeep that had been Thomas's hunting rig and was now held together by welding and hope. The church will pray for rain, Eleanor. Pray for understanding instead, Eleanor said, and picked up her post-hole digger, and Mrs. Patterson drove away, and the casserole sat on the tailgate until the crows found it. By the time the last pipe was buried, the last stake pulled and stacked in the barn for next year's use, the field looked like any other field in early April. The winter wheat was greening, the soil was warming. The robins had returned to the hedgerows, and the dandelions were colonizing the road edges. And the Henderson boys had found other entertainment, though the pictures Caleb had taken appeared in the county paper with a story that was not unkind, but was not kind either, a story about traditional methods and folk agriculture, and a widow's determination to farm the old way, which made it sound like a hobby, like quilting or canning, rather than a survival strategy. Eleanor planted the corn on schedule, the same hybrid variety her neighbors used, the same density, the same fertilizer regimen. She wanted no variables except the ones that mattered. The pipes were invisible now, their open ends capped with flat stones to keep out rodents and debris, their locations marked only by her memory and the map on her kitchen wall. She walked the field every morning, checking the caps, listening to the soil, waiting for the corn to emerge, and the roots to find what she had buried for them. The corn emerged on May 3rd, 2 days after the county average, because the soil around the pipes was slightly cooler, the moisture slightly higher, the germination conditions slightly different. She noted this in the journal she had kept since Thomas's death, a record of weather and planting and yield that no one but her would ever read. The seedlings were strong, dark green, their first leaves unfurling like flags. By the end of May, when the Hendersons' corn was 6 inches high and starting to show the lighter green of nitrogen hunger, Eleanor's was 8 inches and the color of deep summer. She began filling the pipes in June. This was the labor no one had seen, the work that happened in the hours before dawn and after dusk, when the field was hers alone and the only sounds were the owls in the woodlot and the water moving in the 5-gallon buckets she carried from the well. Each pipe took 2 gallons to fill, enough to saturate the clay and establish the capillary gradient, enough to last, she calculated, 7 to 10 days in normal conditions, perhaps 5 in the heat of July. 312 pipes, 624 gallons. She carried them 2 buckets at a time, walking the rows she had memorized, lifting the capstones, pouring the water into the open mouths of the pipes. Listening to it gurgle down into the dark, the first time, it took her 14 hours. She finished at midnight, her back locked in a spasm that kept her awake until 3, her hands shaking so badly she could not hold a cup. The second time, 12 hours. The third, 10. By July, she had developed a rhythm, a route that minimized walking, a technique of pouring that didn't waste a drop. She could fill all 312 pipes in 8 hours, one long day of labor every week, and she scheduled it for Sundays when the Hendersons were at church, and the road was empty, and no one drove by to see the madwoman carrying water to bury in the ground. The corn grew. It grew differently than her neighbors. Theirs was tall, straight, reaching for the sky in the way that corn is supposed to grow, the way that wins prizes at the county fair. Eleanor's was shorter, stockier, the stalks thicker at the base, the leaves broader and darker. The difference was subtle at first, the kind of thing only a farmer would notice, only someone who walked fields every day and read the language of growth. But by mid-July, when the tassels emerged and the silks began to show, the difference was visible from the road. The Hendersons' corn was beginning to show stress, the lower leaves yellowing slightly, the tips of the highest leaves curling on the hottest afternoons. Eleanor's corn was uniformly green from base to tassel, the leaves turgid with moisture, the silks emerging in perfect synchrony with the pollen shed, Caleb Henderson noticed. He drove by slowly one evening in his father's Ford, the muffler still unreplaced, and he looked at the two fields, his and hers, separated only by the fence line and 20 years of history. He did not stop, he did not call out, but he looked, and Eleanor, walking back from the well with empty buckets, saw him looking, and she knew that the laughter was beginning to change its key. The drought began in August. It started as a dry spell, the kind of thing that happens every summer, a week without rain, 10 days, 2 weeks. The corn was in pollination, the most vulnerable stage, and the farmers watched the sky with the particular anxiety of people whose lives depend on things they cannot control. The county extension agent, a young man named David Kowalski, who had never farmed but had a master's degree from the state university, drove the roads and took soil samples and issued bulletins about management strategies for moisture stress. He recommended irrigation, but the creek was already low, and the wells were dropping, and no one had the equipment or the water rights to irrigate 200 acres of corn. He recommended prayer, which he delivered with the embarrassed smile of someone who had been told to include it by his supervisor. Eleanor did not need his bulletins. She had been reading the drought in the leaves for weeks, in the way the corn's stomata closed earlier each afternoon, in the way the soil cracked in patterns that matched the maps in her books. She increased her filling schedule to every 5 days, then every 4. The well held, barely, its output dropping but not failing, and she spent her days in a cycle of carrying and pouring, her body becoming something lean and hard, something that existed only to move water from the well to the pipes and back again. The county fair came and went. The Hendersons' corn took 3rd place in the field corn category, the judges noting good height, adequate pollination, some early season vigor. Eleanor did not enter. She had not been to the fair in 11 years, not since Thomas died in July, and the fair was in August, and the world had seemed like a grotesque carnival that continued without him. But she heard about the judging, heard the talk in the feed store when she went for chicken feed, heard the way the conversation shifted when she entered the room from weather and crops to silence and sideways looks. She's still burying water. Someone said, not quite softly enough, and there was laughter, but it was different now, uncertain. The laughter of people who had mocked something they did not understand and were beginning to suspect they should have. By late August, the dry spell had become something else. The creek dried completely, its bed cracking into polygons that lifted at the edges like scales on a dying fish. The wells began to fail, not all at once, but one by one, the deepest first, then the shallow. until the county was drilling emergency wells, and the state was sending water trucks, and the governor was on television talking about unprecedented conditions and agricultural disaster. The corn that had not been irrigated, and no one had irrigated, no one could irrigate, there was no water to irrigate with, began to die. It started at the bottom. The lower leaves yellowed, then browned, then turned to paper that rattled in the hot wind. The stalks stopped growing. The kernels stopped filling. The plants entered a survival mode that was not survival at all, but simply a slower way of dying. The fields turned from green to gold to brown, not the brown of harvest, but the brown of desiccation, of life withdrawn so completely that the stalks stood empty, the cobs shriveled, the whole landscape becoming a photograph of failure. The Hendersons lost everything. Their 200 acres of corn, their 100 acres of soybeans, the pasture that fed their cattle. They sold the cattle at a loss, the animals thin and wild-eyed, and they took a job at the lumber mill, Caleb and Jude both, working shifts that left them too tired to drive by Eleanor's field and too broke to fix the muffler on the Ford that still sat in their barn, unused, a monument to something that had ended. Harold Crenshaw came by in September. He was not in his cruiser this time. He walked up the road in civilian clothes, his face weathered in a new way, his eyes carrying something that looked almost like fear. "Eleanor," he said, standing at the fence line, looking at her field. "Harold, I've been driving the county roads, helping with the water distribution. You know, the state trucks. I know. Every field is dead, Eleanor. Every single one. The Pattersons, the Hendersons, the church's community garden, everything." He looked at her corn. It was tasseled and silked, the ears filling, the kernels showing the creamy yellow of starch accumulation. The leaves were still green, still turgid, still alive in a landscape that had become monochrome. "Except yours," he said, "except mine." "How?" She was standing by pipe number 147, though he did not know that, could not know that. The capstone was off, the pipe open, and she had just finished her morning filling, the water still moving down through the clay, weeping into the soil, feeding the roots that had found it and wrapped around it and made it part of their architecture. "The pipes, Harold, the pipes I buried. They hold water, they weep water, slowly, constantly, at the rate the roots can drink. No evaporation, no runoff, just enough, always just enough." He stared at the open pipe, at the dark mouth of it, at the moisture that glistened on the interior clay where the water had recently passed. "How many?" 312, and you fill them by hand? Every few days. More often now. That's impossible, Eleanor. The labor, the time. No one could. "I do," she said simply. "I have." He looked at her hands, at the calluses and the scars and the permanent redness of skin that had been wet and dry thousands of times. He looked at her face, thinner than he remembered, the lines deeper, the eyes somehow both tired and fiercely alive. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. "When you were burying them, when we were laughing, why didn't you explain? Would you have believed me, Harold? Would anyone have believed that a woman with no education, no equipment, no money, could outthink the county extension agent and the university and the Department of Agriculture with a bunch of clay pots and a post-hole digger?" He was silent. The wind moved through her corn, the sound of living leaves, a sound that had become rare in the county, precious, almost holy. "No," he said finally. "No, I don't suppose we would have." "Then the laughter was necessary," Eleanor said. "It kept me working. It kept me from doubting, and now—" She gestured at the field, at the green that should not exist, at the life that persisted in the midst of death. "Now the laughter has stopped." It had stopped, mostly. There was still talk, of course, the kind of talk that happens in small towns when something inexplicable occurs. The talk of miracles and luck, and the strange ways of the woman, who had always been a little odd, a little too solitary, a little too much like her dead husband, who had also been odd, also solitary, also convinced that the old ways held answers the new ways had forgotten. But the talk was different now, edged with something that was not quite respect, but was moving toward it, the way a river moves toward the sea, inevitable if slow. The university came in October. They arrived in a convoy of white vehicles, extension service trucks and state agriculture vans, and a rental car with a man in a suit who turned out to be from the Federal Department of Agriculture, though what he was doing in Millbrook, no one could say. They set up equipment in Eleanor's barn, measuring devices and soil probes and cameras on tripods, and they asked permission to enter the field, which she granted, though she insisted on walking with them, showing them the pipes, explaining the system in the same words she had used with Harold, the same words she had rehearsed in her head through all the years of silence and labor. Dr. Sarah Chen was the lead researcher, a soil scientist from the state university who had written papers on deficit irrigation and root zone moisture management, and who had never, in her academic career, encountered anything like what she found in Eleanor Vance's south field. She knelt by pipe number 89, which Eleanor had opened for her, and she touched the clay interior, felt the moisture, watched the way the water level dropped almost imperceptibly as the capillary action did its work. "This is Olla irrigation," Dr. Chen said, not to Eleanor but to the graduate student taking notes beside her, but scaled, massively scaled. "I've seen this in research papers on traditional agriculture, but never at this size. Never in a commercial field." "Not commercial," Eleanor said. "Subsistence. I eat what I grow. I sell what I don't need. I don't farm for profit, Dr. Chen. I farm to live." Dr. Chen looked up at her, at the woman in the worn coat standing in her own field among the corn that should not exist, and something in her face shifted, the professional mask slipping to reveal something more personal, more human. "Mrs. Vance," she said, "do you understand what you've done? The water use efficiency here, the soil moisture retention, the root architecture. We've been trying to engineer systems that do what your pipes do naturally. Drip irrigation, subsurface drip, all of it expensive, all of it dependent on plastic and pressure and energy. But this is passive, this is sustainable, this is—" She stopped, searching for a word. "Old," Eleanor supplied. "It's old, Dr. Chen. Older than the wells, older than the pumps, as old as farming itself in some places. I just remembered it, and I built it, and I worked it, and it worked." The measurements took 3 days. They measured soil moisture at 6-inch intervals to a depth of 4 feet. They measured root density and root depth, and the distribution of fine roots around the pipes. They measured yield, harvesting test plots with hand shears and weighing the grain in portable scales, comparing Eleanor's field to the control plots in the dead fields nearby. The difference so stark that the graduate student began to cry at one point, overwhelmed by the contrast between life and death, between wisdom and ignorance, between the woman who had worked alone in the dark and the world that had laughed at her. The results were published the following spring in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture in a paper titled "Passive Subsurface Clay Pipe Irrigation, a Forgotten Technology for Water-Scarce Agriculture." Dr. Chen was the first author, as was proper, but Eleanor Vance was listed second, her name appearing in academic print for the first time in her 54 years. The widow from Millbrook, who had buried pipes in her field and been laughed at, and was now, officially, a contributor to the scientific literature. The paper was read. It was cited. It was presented at conferences where PowerPoint slides showed Eleanor's field, green against brown, and where Dr. Chen told the story of the woman who had carried 600 gallons of water by hand every week, who had sold her grandmother's dresser to buy pottery, who had worked in silence while the world mocked her. The world stopped mocking. The Hendersons came in November, after Eleanor's corn had yielded 62 bushels to the acre in a year when the county average was 12, when many farmers had nothing to harvest at all. They came on foot, walking up the road in work clothes that were not their own, borrowed or thrifted, their faces carrying the particular shame of men who have lost everything and must ask for help from the person they once laughed at. Caleb spoke first, as he always had. But his voice was different now, smaller, the voice of someone who had learned that the world was larger than his understanding. "Eleanor," he said, standing at her door, not coming onto the porch without invitation. We need to ask you something." She waited. She had been shelling beans on the porch, the last of the season, her fingers moving with the automatic skill of decades. "The pipes," Jude said, unable to wait for his brother to finish. "The pipes you buried, we need to know how, for next year, if there's a next year. If we can get land again, if we can borrow, if—" He stopped, the words choking him. The reality of their situation too large for the small vocabulary of apology. "I'll show you," Eleanor said. She showed them. She walked them through the field, now stubble after harvest, and she showed them the pipe locations, the capstones, the angle of burial, the depth, the spacing. She gave them her books, the ones from the used bookstores, with her notes in the margins and her calculations on the end papers. She gave them her map, the graph paper, with its constellation of circles, and she explained the math, the capillary physics, the soil science that she had taught herself in the years after Thomas died, when the nights were long and the silence was heavy, and the only way to survive was to learn. "Why?" Caleb asked finally, holding the map in hands that were not used to holding paper. "Why are you helping us after everything we said? Everything we did, the pictures, the laughing, He could not finish. The memory of his own cruelty was too recent, too sharp. "Because you need it," Eleanor said. "Because the water table will keep dropping. Because the droughts will keep coming. Because in 10 years, or 20, or 50, everyone who farms this land will need to know what I know. And if I keep it to myself because you were cruel when you were ignorant, then I'm no better than you were." She looked at them, at the men who had been boys once, who had been raised by a father who had taught them that farming was a competition, that weakness was mockable, that women who did strange things were funny rather than frightening. "The pipes don't care who laughs," she said. "The soil doesn't care who carries the water. The corn doesn't care whose field it grows in. It only cares that someone remembers, that someone works, that someone doesn't give up." They left with the books and the map and a borrowed post-hole digger, and she watched them go, and she knew that they would struggle, that they would make mistakes, that they might fail again, but they would know. The knowledge was loose in the world now, no longer hers alone, and it would move through the county like water through clay, slowly, persistently, finding the roots that needed it. The university came back the next spring, and the spring after that. They brought funding, grants from foundations concerned with water scarcity and climate adaptation, and they built a research station on the edge of Eleanor's property, a small facility with a laboratory and a classroom and dormitories for the graduate students who came to study what they called, in their papers and presentations, the Vance System. Eleanor let them build it, let them use her field as a living laboratory, let them name things after her that she did not need named. She continued to farm, continued to fill her pipes, continued to walk the rows in the early mornings and late evenings, though now she sometimes had help. A graduate student or two who wanted to understand not just the science but the labor, the body cost, the sheer physical reality of carrying water to 312 pipes by hand. She never lectured. She demonstrated. She showed them the calluses on her hands, the curve of her spine from years of lifting, the efficiency of movement she had developed through repetition and necessity. She showed them that technology was not just invention but also persistence, not just ideas but also work, not just the flash of insight but the long years of carrying water in the dark while the world slept and laughed and forgot. Dr. Chen wrote a book. It was called The Water Remembered, Rediscovering Ancient Irrigation in a Drying World, and it was published by a university press and reviewed in places that had never heard of Millbrook, in languages Eleanor did not speak. The book had a chapter on Eleanor titled The Woman Who Buried Water, and it described her system in technical detail and her character in something approaching awe. It described the day Dr. Chen had first seen the field, green in a brown world, and had understood that she was in the presence of something that was not just agricultural innovation, but also moral courage. The courage to be laughed at, to be called crazy, to work alone in the face of universal skepticism, because the work was necessary, and the truth was true whether anyone believed it or not. The book was translated into 14 languages. It was used in universities in places where water was even scarcer than in Millbrook, in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and the American Southwest, where farmers read about the woman with the terracotta pipes and began to adapt her methods to their own soils, their own crops, their own climates. The Vance System spread, not through marketing or government programs, but through the slow accumulation of need and proof, the way that good ideas always spread, the way that water moves through clay, finding the paths of least resistance, nourishing what it touches. Eleanor Vance died in her sleep in the winter of 2019, at the age of 84, in the farmhouse where she had been born and where she had lived all her life except for the 2 years of her marriage, when she and Thomas had tried the city and found it wanting. She died with her hands still marked by the work, the calluses permanent now, the skin permanently stained with the red clay that had been her companion for 30 years. She died with the map still on her kitchen wall, the graph paper yellowed and fragile, the circles of her pipes still visible, still marking the field that had become, in the decades since the drought, a place of pilgrimage for people who wanted to understand what she had understood. That the old ways were not obsolete, that the body was still a tool, that water was still life, and that the willingness to work in silence while the world laughed was sometimes the only thing that separated survival from extinction. They buried her in the churchyard, in the plot beside Thomas, in the ground that she had spent her life understanding. The funeral was attended by people she had never met, scientists and farmers and government officials and representatives of international development organizations, people who had read about her in books and papers and who had come to pay respects to a woman who had never sought their respect. The Hendersons were there, old men now, their own pipes buried in fields they had managed to reclaim through the knowledge she had given them, their grandchildren farming land that would have been lost without the woman they had once laughed at from a passing truck. Dr. Chen spoke at the funeral, standing in the church where Mrs. Patterson had once brought a casserole and worried about the mad woman burying pipes. She spoke about science and tradition and the intersection of the two. She spoke about water and soil and the courage of one woman who had trusted her own knowledge against the consensus of the world. And she spoke, finally, about the laughter, the mockery that had been the soundtrack to Eleanor's years of labor, the sound that had not stopped her, that had perhaps even strengthened her, the sound that had turned, slowly, into something else. They laughed when she buried terracotta pipes in her field. Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying in the small church, reaching the rafters where the swallows nested in summer. They laughed because they did not understand. They laughed because what she was doing looked like madness, like waste, like the desperate act of a woman who had lost her grip on reality. But Eleanor Vance was not mad. She was not wasting. She was not desperate. She was simply ahead of them. She had read the books they had not read. She had learned the lessons they had not learned. She had seen the future they refused to see, a future of water scarcity and failing wells and crops that died in the field because no one had prepared for the drought that was coming. She paused, looking at the simple coffin, at the flowers that had been grown in Eleanor's own garden, watered by the pipes that still wept in the field outside. And when the drought came, Dr. Chen continued, when the creek dried and the wells failed and the county turned brown, Eleanor Vance's field was the only green, not because of luck, not because of miracle, but because of work, because of knowledge, because of 312 terracotta pipes buried by hand, filled by hand, maintained by hand year after year, in the face of laughter and doubt, and the absolute certainty of everyone who knew better that she was wrong. She looked at the congregation, at the farmers and the scientists, and the family, at the world that had finally caught up to the woman they were burying. They laughed until the drought left her the only green. And then they stopped laughing. And then they started learning. And because of that learning, because of the knowledge that Eleanor Vance carried in her hands and her back, and her stubborn, beautiful mind, there are fields green today, in places that would have been brown. There are farmers eating today who would have been hungry. There is water being saved today that would have been wasted. And there is a system, a method, a way of farming that will outlast the wells and the pumps and the plastic irrigation tape, because it is made of clay and soil and human labor, the things that have always been and will always be, as long as there are people willing to bury pipes in the ground and carry water in the dark and believe against all evidence, against all mockery, that the old wisdom still speaks if we are quiet enough to listen. The coffin was lowered into the ground. The soil was thrown on top, the red clay that Eleanor had known so well, that had stained her hands and her clothes and her life. And in the field beyond the churchyard, the pipes still sat in their holes, still wept their moisture, still fed the soil that would grow corn again in the spring, that would grow corn for years to come, that would grow corn as long as someone remembered to lift the capstones and pour the water and trust the clay to do what it had been doing. Since the first potter shaped the first vessel and the first farmer understood that water could be held as well as carried, the laughter had stopped long ago. The learning continued. The field remained green.